Okay, welcome back. This is midnight in Brussels, and we have Gauri Kandekar on Skype phone, and we are delighted to talk to her. We do this every month, and we find out what's going on, really going on in Europe, because we need to know. We need to appreciate everything in the world. We can't be an isolated set of islands, and Gauri can help us. Welcome to the show yet again, Gauri.
Thank you, Jay. It's a pleasure once again.
Yes, absolutely, every time. So, Gary Kandekar, if you didn't know, is the Deputy Director and the Director of Europe for Global Relations Forum, and she's our Think Tech European correspondent now for quite some time. So we get into a kind of, we have threads we follow with her to try to determine exactly what direction Europe is moving and, find the real deal in Europe. And for that matter, her connection is with India, so we find the real deal in terms of the relationship between Europe and India, too. So the first thing on the agenda today is President Obama's trip to Europe, especially the UK. Why did he make that trip, Gary, and what happened?
Well, basically, there are a couple of reasons. Yes, he's bowing down as the president at the moment. I guess the presidential elections are pushing him to bow down quicker than normal in a way. But he just wanted to meet his biggest allies in the region. So he took a trip to the UK and to Germany, but in particular, his trip to the UK has been quite poignant because there is a referendum coming soon, national referendum in the UK of their membership to the EU. And that's quite high on the European agenda at the moment because Britain, as you know, has been, or the UK rather, has been quite Eurosceptic, meaning they don't really have a nice relationship with Europe. They don't trust Europe. They see it as as an organization that imposes laws, and they face a lot of migration. So they're not really happy with the European Union and their membership of it. So they want to withdraw. A large number of people think that they would be better off without the EU. Now, the US is seeing this as quite dangerous for trade relations. Europe as a trade bloc, but also their influence in Europe, because UK is the biggest ally the US has across the Atlantic, and given that the UK has a steering role in EU politics, means it's a big asset for the US. So these elements make up quite a big consideration for the US foreign policy.
Yeah, so I guess he went to Europe because he wanted to shore up the relationship between the UK and the EU, and tell them all personally and in public that he wants them to continue that relationship. He doesn't want to see it come apart for American interests. Yeah.
Exactly. And he's even been quite vocal in the UK, saying, basically advising the people of the UK to stay in the EU. Now, this has, of course, not been appreciated by various quarters. If you see the ruling party, the Tories, they are quite divided themselves on the EU membership. So there are many, many leaders of the Tory party that don't want the UK to stay. And I can maybe explain later why they don't want to stay in the EU. But yeah, David Cameron, the UK Prime Minister, is very much for EU membership. He sees the EU as central to UK existence, basically, its survival, its economic persistence, its foreign policy. So he sees the EU as quite key. There are others, including another Tory colleague of his and the mayor of London, a quite charismatic leader called Boris Johnson, and he's been quite vehemently supporting UK exit from the EU, which is called a Brexit. Termed here.
Yes, Brexit, yes. Brexit.
Yes, Brexit. After Brexit, they've dubbed UK exit as Brexit. So you see, even the Tory party is quite divided. And so President Obama coming to the UK and speaking to the public, saying that, you should stay in the EU was not seen as really useful by many people and also seen as meddling in national politics. But I mean, it's the West. Meddling in national politics is quite a pillar of
Well,
Western
is there
foreign
any
policy.
talk that maybe Cameron asked him to come, asked him to lobby, against Brexit?
Well, Obama has been quite a staunch ally of David Cameron, especially in all those years with the financial crisis and all the foreign policy challenges. So they've been quite good friends. They even went golfing, by the way, on the tour, yeah. But but it was helpful for Cameron's case. He's lobbying quite hard for the UK to stay inside the EU.
What about his trip to Germany? What happened there, and how would you compare his visit there with his visit to the UK?
Well, his trip to Germany was more about economic relations, but also to meet Angela Merkel, who's been, a good ally and friend to Obama over the years. And he basically attended the Hanover Messe, which is a huge trade fair which takes place in Hanover, and not many US presidents visit Hanover. So they have basically been speaking about migration issues, relations between the government and Islamic State, and what's to be done about it. So it's more about the broader mix of foreign policy when on his trip to Germany. But the UK was more about the EU, in particular.
Well, I think it demonstrates that the American president, whether he's Barack Obama or any of the candidates now coming, has a duty. Country has a duty to be involved and to have relations with Europe, and to be a constructive and a leadership force in holding things together. And what I wanted to ask you though, Gary, is this: we talked a couple of times ago about the vote in Scotland, about how there was this movement in Scotland wanted to get away from the UK,
Yes.
and there was a fair number of people, big discussion about let's leave the UK and do our own thing. And
Yes.
it's not, there's two ways to do this. One is let's work together, collaboration. Let's make
Yes.
it bigger and use economies of scale. And the other
Yes.
way is we don't want you, we don't need you, we'll do our own thing, we're going to separate from you. And it's the same kind of mindset, isn't it, that makes people want to, leave the EU. We're going to do this by ourselves, as the people in Scotland who wanted to do Scotland by themselves. What is in the water here? What is the virus that, what is the feeling that makes people want to leave the existing structure, do it by themselves? It's like, let's take this all apart instead of let's build it together.
You're right. I mean, you hit the nail, I think, on the head directly. There's when if you see there's a perception of growing nationalism across the world. Yeah, I mean, countries are becoming more nationalistic, national interest. There's not this wave that had begun in Europe of integration. So that has slowed down. The momentum of integration has slowed down. If you examine the cases of the Scottish referendum and the EU referendum, now you see two different perspectives. Yes, the Scottish referendum had more sentimental issues, more nationalistic values attached to it. So they wanted to be a country, and they of course have this history with the UK, and they've been seen as oppressed to a certain extent. But the relationship now, I mean, the referendum on the EU membership now speaks a bit on nationalism, but also to the challenges. So, what the challenges that the UK faces from the EU at the moment are? Firstly, many Brits see laws coming from Brussels directly as imposed on them, and that's also related to the media, yes? I mean, it's also how the media portrays it. If anything is quite unpalatable, they say, well, it's imposed by Brussels. And if anything is good, for example, roaming charges will be dropped across Europe, yes?
That's good.
That is more, politicians tend to take credit for that, local politicians, when it comes from Brussels. The second issue is migration, not from, outside of Europe mainly, but internally as well. So for the moment, UK has an opt out from the Schengen zone, yes, of free movement, which means that migrants from outside the EU, like Syria, Iraq, cannot directly come to the UK from these other EU member states, because the UK has its own borders. But there's been a lot of migration from Central and Eastern Europe to the UK, and it's putting a lot of pressure on the UK social system. And they do have an obligation because of EU rules to cover them by the social system as well. So that's another consideration. But also foreign policy challenges, how the EU works, how it doesn't work. I mean, these are all considerations that play in, that come into play. But overall, the picture has changed so much over the past 50 years, 60 years if you want, or more. When the EU was created, the main impetus behind it was to keep the Germans down, keep the Russians out, and keep the US in. I mean, it's quite a famous cliche.
Putting it in
Yes.
a few words, yeah.
I'm not making it up. So these were the key considerations, yes? But Europe has changed today. I mean, you don't need to keep the Germans down anymore. Um, there's a greater understanding that, all these countries on the same page, they face the same threats. The threat is no longer internal and European. So now the considerations have become more economic in nature.
Yes.
And this is why they feel a bit more liberty to think, okay, we can do without the EU and we don't need to stay in the EU. And besides, I mean, the UK still has this Commonwealth organization. So, I mean, it has its own large foreign policy. It is still a global actor, although of a diminishing nature. But so it sees itself as better off to some extent without the EU.
Well, if I asked you to look into the future, sort of the ghost of Christmas future,
Yes.
and gave you the two possibilities here in this election, which is like a month away, right? In early June, I want to say June 3rd. What will happen if the EU, or rather, if UK votes against, the EU? They want to separate from the EU. What will happen? And compare that with what will happen if they stay with the EU. I mean, and I'm really asking for your opinion about which way is best.
I was just thinking about it this morning. And to be really honest, it's not going to be an existential question either or. Even if the UK leaves the EU, both the UK and the EU will survive. And not survive, they will thrive as they continue now with, low growth rates. But still, I mean, nothing is going to collapse really. If they're inside the EU, well and good, you muddle on. But one of the main uh, um, considerations that have been thrown out to the public is that from the pro EU side, yes, that we're going to lose out on economic gains and on trade. And this is a topic of my next paper actually, which says that no, the UK will not lose out on trade because it will still be part of the common market, like Turkey is, perhaps without the free movement of people, but the common market, it will still be part of this free trade area. So trade with the EU will go on, and the UK's main trade is like all other European partners within the EU, yes? But when it comes to free trade agreements abroad, the EU is terribly slow. I mean, there are free trade negotiations that have been going on for almost a decade, like the India Free Trade Agreement, the Japan one. They've been going on for a long, long time. And when they negotiate these free trade agreements, one, the EU has to take into account all 28 positions of its 28 member states, which at times can be in contradiction with UK position. So there's a big compromise. So getting that already slows things down. Second is that the EU insists on having these human rights clauses many times, and now with the Treaty of Lisbon, which is the last European Union treaty signed in 2009, the European Parliament has got greater say in negotiations, and the Parliament is really adamant that without these human rights and environmental and normative clauses, it will not sign trade agreements. Now, this is quite problematic because, in third countries, so outside the EU, they don't want to be seen as, being imposed something, because if there is some sort of human right abuse and the agreement does not specify what kind, the trade agreement could be suspended. It's the same with the US. Yes, the US is also negotiating a free trade agreement with the EU at the moment. So if you see the death penalty in the US, it still exists, right? And it's quite high, the number of death penalties each year. So the EU could at some point suspend the agreement, and nobody wants that, nobody wants the stress of it. So either way, I think UK could also stand to benefit from an exit
Interesting.
with in terms of trade. Yeah, yeah.
I've been operating on the assumption that, and tell me if I'm wrong, that one of the big elements in this whole Brexit initiative is that the UK doesn't like what's happening with the migrants. They don't like the social and economic burden of the migrants. They don't like to have to deal with them. And they think that whatever is happening in Europe is something they don't want a part of. At the same time, they have their own issue about migrants and about changing demographic, changing population. I remember reading that one of the candidates, possibly the winning candidate for the mayor of London, is a Middle Eastern candidate. So am I right about this? Am I right that the people who want Brexit really want to get away from the whole migrant issue?
Of course, that's a huge consideration as well. I mean, if you see the news, some media in the UK, almost also like the Daily Mail, which is not a really good paper to read, but I mean, they churn up these sentiments, which are, to be really honest, they are issues that people are talking across Europe. And one of the reasons for the rise of these far-right parties across Europe is because they're the only parties that are willing to discuss this and find solutions, The mainstream parties are seeming to, push it down people's throats without having a real debate. So you're absolutely right. This is a main issue because already they have migration from Central and Eastern Europe, like we discussed. But with these hundreds of thousands of migrants that have come, which is also seen as a Merkel open door policy, the UK citizens think that in a few years, when these migrants will be given national card, permanent residency cards in EU member states, they will get the right to move freely inside the UK, yes, and abuse this national health service, which is, quite important there, and other social services.
Costs money.
It's going to cost enormous amounts of money. Now, one of the flaws in Europe at the moment, in terms of, the demographic challenge, the growing demographic mushroom, but also what to do about it. I don't think migrants or asylum seekers are the solution, really. I mean, what the US does is they take the best brains from across the world, it's brain drain. And these kind of policies are not really going out well in Europe at the moment. I mean, they still have quite restrictive measures for service industry from countries like India and China, which have quite bright minds, engineers, doctors, but then you have all these asylum seekers and you have to take them in, but then they're going to have to get jobs there. So it depends on what kind of economy you want and targeted employment, I think.
Yeah. Well, and then, you run an interesting parallel because there are a fair number of people in the EU and in UK who would really rather not take care of migrants at all. And then if you look at Donald Trump, he's also an isolationist, relatively speaking. And I know that people in Europe don't like him too much. But that will have an effect if he gets to be the Republican candidate, or some people don't like the idea, or if he wins the presidency in the U.S., that's going to have a big effect on all of this. And it's going to reveal, whether the world in general is going for a larger collaboration or, escapism. What do you think is going to happen to Brexit? What do you think the vote's going to be? Do you have a feeling about it one way or the other?
No, it's so close, Jay. It's so close. I really don't know. I think I wouldn't be too surprised if the UK would choose to leave.
Yeah. Well,
But
I think what's interesting is this comes up, and all of a sudden, just as in Scotland, the people in a given jurisdiction, they realize that yes, they have the power to vote, A or nay on it. They have the power to secede, if you will, or not. And
yes.
this kind of plebiscite is very empowering for the population in general. And what strikes me is that however this vote goes here in June, only a few weeks away, it's not the end of the issue. Because as it came up this time, it could come up again next time, in a year, or 2 years, or whenever. The same vote all over again.
It will, and I'll tell you why. I mean, it's really funny. So first, the Scots were they were petrified into staying with the UK, yes? They were told that, the banks would collapse and markets would leave, and businesses would leave. So they were basically really scared into staying inside the UK. But now, I mean, if there is a Brexit, the Scottish referendum will come up again. Yeah, and you know why? Because the Scots are quite pro-European, and they would want to stay inside the EU.
Interesting.
So I mean, and there's no border inside the UK, so they will have to construct new borders. So it's going to be quite funny, and then there's so many UK nationals who have Scottish or English parents, mixed, and they won't know which nationality to take and how to sort that out. So it's going to be a right mess.
I'm sure when you go out on the street and have a coffee or have a meal or go to the store, everything seems very normal. But in fact, and the same as it was last year and 10 years ago, but in fact, Europe is changing. So many things are changing.
Yeah.
And it could be argued that things are unraveling too, because these are not necessarily good changes that will, build a better Europe or build a better EU. And I wonder where it's all going. I mean, what is the sense of the people? Are they optimistic about things in general or not?
No, honestly, to take a broader view, I don't think the public in general is optimistic in Europe. And the reason why is because of the economy, yes? I mean, economically, it's not going too well. And then you have the added stress of the migrant crisis, which, to be honest, is not as big for Europe as it could be, yes? I mean, we've just published a new paper on the same issue, Europe's migrant crisis. Is it a solely European problem? And it turns out it's not. I mean, Europe doesn't even receive more than Jordan receives per capita, basically, its
Yeah.
population. But overall, the mood is really terrible here. EU politics, the EU is seen as being on the brink itself, of existence. The migrant issue has brought existential questions to the EU debate. Its Schengen area free movement is under threat. I mean, countries are erecting borders again.
Yeah, and speaking of borders, the one item that we were going to talk about is the French Prime Minister calling for a ban on Islamic headscarves in universities and places of higher education.
Yeah.
What's that all about? What does that reflect? Will he succeed? What effect will it have?
I don't think he's gonna succeed in, to be honest. I mean, it was French Prime Minister Manuel Valls who said that, they should ban headscarves, Muslim headscarves, and Muslim headscarves in particular at universities, French universities. This has been brought up by Nicolas Sarkozy, was the former president of France, but it didn't go through. I think Manuel Vaz is playing at some um bigger politics here because the presidential elections would be soon, and maybe he would want to stand for presidency. President Hollande's popularity ratings are the lowest of any French president in history. So it plays more into that, and he's taking a more populist issue on the mind, and he's saying that most of the people don't want to see the headscarves. Now, in France, you cannot wear religious symbols. It's a like country, so it means that they have a separation of church and state, and religious symbols are banned at universities. So you cannot wear a cross or any other symbol.
Interesting.
Yeah, the burqa has been banned as well a couple of years ago. Um, and it goes into more of a or it's being portrayed as more of an Islamophobic debate, but you'd never know what it is, and it just shows the level of discomfort people are having with Islam here in Europe. um, and there are worse of things that are happening in other countries, yes, but I mean French universities have spoken out against um, this issue, and they're saying that we have greater problems to solve.
So, how do the students feel?
Well, most of the students have been against it. I mean, it's if you look at Twitter, and they've been posting with the hashtag, what universities really want, basically. And sorry, I'm paraphrasing that. But yeah, I mean, they've been expressing what they really want, and they don't want to get involved in this kind of politics of headscarves or not, and it doesn't really change the perception that of students have of each other. Probably it's as long as the burqa has, I think the burqa is is a stronger symbol than a headscarf.
Yeah.
And if you see now, French universities get a lot of foreign students, and it's also revenue for the university, so they don't want to jeopardize that.
What about this kind of Islamophobia that you mentioned? We had some serious terrorism, and it was clear that it came from Islamic groups, and people must have been really rattled by it. And I remember you were rattled by it.
Yes, completely. Still,
How are they feeling now? I mean, the flow of migrants has slowed. We can talk about that,
yes.
but the effect of the migrant experience is still playing out, and the reaction to that is still playing out. So where are people going on this? And not only in Germany and Belgium, of course, and France. Is there an Islamophobia in the air these days?
Definitely. Since the past 10 years, there's been a marked change in Europe. And I think we discussed this quite a few times of how Europe has changed over the past 10 years. And it's shocking, it doesn't resemble anything that it was before. I mean, the monument's still the same, but the mentality has changed, people on the ground have changed. And there's a huge uneasiness with Islam in general. You have to understand that Europe has not been a traditional, culturally diverse society in that sense, a religiously diverse, sorry. I mean, it's a more Christian values, and a bit of Judaism as well, but Islam as such has been there for some time, but in the lower parts of Europe, Spain, of course, but not as present as you would say perhaps in India. So people are still trying to understand what Islam really is. Is it, a really peaceful religion, or why is there terrorism coming from this religious group? And so it's it's a new phenomenon rather here. It's a relatively new phenomenon. So of course there's going to be unease at the moment, and
Yeah.
given these extreme elements in Islam, who are causing damage to
Yeah.
society,
It
and we
all
don't.
it all translates into money somehow. What I mean is, the more security that you feel you need to have, the more it costs you. I'm sure that in Brussels they're spending more on security now than they were a few months ago, and the
Definitely.
same in Paris, and that affects the economy. Then you have to have the social safety net, which costs really a lot of money. And then the EU, never really resolved the problem with Greece. So I heard you say before that people are concerned about the economy of the EU. The UK is concerned about the economy of the EU. And the EU is paying Turkey to hold the migrants inside of Turkey. I mean,
Yes.
this is changing the money flow. It's changing, what do you want to call it, the disposition of disposable income by a number of countries. And this has got to have a serious effect on every country and on the EU and the continent in general, no?
For sure, I mean, the economic burden has increased, and is increasing when growth is decreasing. So it's true. I mean, if you see the case of Greece itself, Greece and Italy have been the countries that have been most affected by the economic and financial and the European debt crisis, or crises rather. But they've also been the most burdened by the migrant crisis. So much so that they've not had the possibility to register the migrants, because given the Dublin Convention, which is a European convention for migrants, the country of first entry is the one responsible to carry out all the administrative tasks. But they've been so overwhelmed and cash strapped that they just couldn't do it. And then you have the agreement with Turkey, of course, which is just going to be a circus. I mean, they're just going to go around and come back around. So I don't really think it's going to work so well. Um, but it's true. You're quite right.
Well, in Turkey, by the way, a footnote to this is there was a piece in the news this morning here about Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico can't pay some $400 or $500 million. It's due on a $17 billion debt. And nobody knows what's going to happen to Puerto Rico. So, it's like the question hangs in the air. It's sort of the way the question hung in the air on Greece. And these are very disruptive events, very disruptive dilemmas, where you have countries, that can't pay their bills and nobody knows what to do about it. And some of these countries, well, they're going to be failed states economically. So
Yes.
now in the case of Turkey, I wanted to ask you about Turkey, because Turkey, is the channel from Syria to Europe, and it's by which all the migrants come in, and by which they're now being detained, and by which there's become a fair amount of terrorism sporadically around Turkey recently, a few days ago, and so Turkey has to be affected economically as well as politically by all that is happening in Syria and on its borders, by the migrants who are staying there, by all the political and diplomatic demands that are being made. What is happening to Turkey? How is Turkey doing? How is Erdogan doing?
Well, as you know, Erdogan is not a really popular leader in Turkey, anyways. I mean, he's corrupt. He's seen as authoritarian, and I think the Turkish people would rather another leader. But that aside, Turkey is facing enormous challenges of its own. Turkey does not have strong borders, or any borders rather, with these Middle Eastern neighbors. So you could travel quite freely from Iran or Syria into Turkey, or the other countries in the region, and then go back. And now, as you see, it's used as a transit country. Then it has its own problems with the Kurds. And now you have the imbroglio with Russia, and it's stressful, of course. I mean, Turkey is seen as a buffer zone, probably. And that's why the EU has been cultivating its relationship with Turkey over the past 50 years, and almost giving it the carrot or dangling the carrot of membership. But it is and would remain a kind of a buffer zone for the EU, which is true. And I think it's in the EU's interest as well to see that Turkey survives. These are huge challenges. So it's great that Turkish economy is not as worse as its political and security status. But once that these effects of Greece or the European economies start to shave off on Turkey, it cannot escape simply.
Yeah. And then, I don't know if the American press and the European press are together on this, but there's a certain suggestion that maybe ISIS is declining. I would have hoped a long time ago they would have declined. The Russians had an effect on them. I think
Yes.
Obama has been deploying troops and, forces of one kind or another to try to pull the rug out from under them and to stop, disconnect them with their money, their oil money and other things. And I wonder what the European press is saying about that. What is the sense about the success or the continuing success or possibly the decline of ISIS these days?
It's funny that because this question of ISIS keeps popping up in the middle, and it's like somebody is sitting in a room of and it happens. Yes, I mean it's a scenario, quite realistic one, in these European conference rooms, and you're talking about, oh, will EU survive? Will Brexit happen? What about the economy, trade agreements? And then somebody pokes their hand up and says, what about ISIS? And it's just like that. It's true. You don't know what's really happening on the ground. I mean, the Russians are there, these whole other coalitions are there, and then the other actors, and of course the Western coalitions are there. And there's a mixture of all these different actors, and then the Kurds, and then the Yazidis, and you don't know what's really happening, in Syria until somebody stops. It's either ISIS falls or Assad falls, and it's quite confusing. But for the moment, I mean, you're right. The Russians have had an impact. But to be honest, like we spoke, earlier as well in Afghanistan as well. I mean, if the Western nations and all these coalitions really wanted to stem ISIS, they would have.
Yes.
It's not that hard. I mean,
Yes, I think that's a really important point, Gary, that if we got together on it and if we focused ourselves and collaborated on destroying ISIS, we could do it. And the
right.
only reason it continues to exist is because we haven't gotten together on it.
Yeah, but also, there's so many considerations. I mean, they do serve some interests in the region as well, maybe, for keeping governments in power. I mean, it's a strong impetus, yeah?
Yeah.
So you don't know which interests they serve, and all this secrecy that surrounds it. It's, I think, one of the biggest theories. How do you say the conspiracy theories that to unravel. I would be so interested in really finding out whose interests do they really serve.
Yeah. It's a confusion and a lot is happening behind the curtain. And you
Exactly.
just don't know who's motivating what and who's pulling the strings. So let's talk about your writing these days. What is Global Relations Forum writing about, and when can we see your next article, and what will it be about, and can you give us an advance on it?
Yes, well, lots of things on the table for me and the think tank. We just published a paper on the migrant crisis, like I
You
mentioned, and
mentioned,
that
yes.
will be circulated. Of course, we'll be sending you a copy
Please.
with our best regards. But at the moment, we're looking towards energy issues and urban development. I myself have been quite involved in the EU-India relationship, and actually the EU-India summit that just took place in March. They adopted two suggestions that I made to set up a forum on urbanization and to create an urban development dialogue at the ministerial level. So I'm pretty happy about
That's
that.
great.
Um,
Congratulations.
Thank you. So, so they've taken that up, and so we're moving a lot more into urbanization and urban development. That's one area, and then of course security, which has been quite a big passion of mine, counterterrorism, and I'm writing things on that as well. So,
Are you still engaged in trying to figure out the relationship between the EU and India? Have you been traveling there?
yes, I have been traveling. I will be going again, and we're hosting two events in June on energy and urbanization, as I spoke to you about. So we're trying to work with a new format, of trying really getting policy change through, because what we have now, these debates and workshops, they don't really seem to work that much. So we're rolling out a quite new and very exciting method of getting policy change through, and I'll be happy to tell you about it the next time we
Yes,
meet,
the
perhaps.
next time. And you might also consider, doing a paper on the diplomatic relations between the EU, India, and Hawaii.
Oh, I'd love to do that. I would love to do that. Actually, we should do a conference on that and get you to Brussels.
There you go. That's Gauri Kandekar of Global Relations Forum. She's the deputy director and director of Europe for the forum, and she's our Think Tech European correspondent. And we talk to her every month. And we are sorry we won't talk to you for another month, but we are glad that we talked to you today or tonight, as the case may be. Thank you so much, Gauri.
Thank you so much, Jace. What a pleasure. Thanks.
Aloha.